but I wanted to welcome all of you to Conflict Styles and Surviving All This Togetherness. So Ronald Reagan said at one point, peace is not the absence of conflict, but it's how we deal with conflict. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, not how to get rid of conflict, but how we deal with conflict when it comes up. And in these crazy times that we're going through right now, I imagine that there is a lot of conflict that's arising in people's lives and their homes and their work, because things are changing and changes cause conflict. So that's what we're going to talk about today as we go through this process. So I just want to introduce myself. I know most of you, some of you I don't know, but I'm Patrice Ciccarelli. I'm a leadership coach. You can find out more about me at pecleadership.com. And at any point after this, if you have any questions for me or want to learn more, feel free to reach out to me at my email address. So, so can you all hear me? I just want you to give me the thumbs up if you can hear me. Yep, I'm getting thumbs up. Excellent. Very good. Okay. So we're going to start by taking a poll. I'm going to put a poll up here because I'm curious how conflict has changed in people's lives. So go ahead and take this poll and let me know, has conflict changed in your life? Has it changed significantly, a little bit, about the same, reduced a little bit? All right, so it looks like a lot of people are saying that has increased a little bit, and some saying it's increased significantly. 20% remain about the same, and some people saying it's reduced a little bit. Those might be the people who are working from home and don't have anybody else living in their house, so maybe their conflict has reduced a little bit. So what we're going to walk away with today, or what I'm hoping we walk away with today, is we're going to understand 5 different conflict modes and approaches to conflict. As we go through this, we're going to think about our own conflict modes. So as we talk about them and we look at the examples, think about yourself and how you approach conflict, and then we'll talk about some tools to help deal with conflict as we go through it. So I was in a meeting yesterday and I was talking to somebody about the word mindset. We were talking about a new class and creating this class, and I was saying, well, that's a good class for mindset. And they said, well, no, this isn't mindset at all. And it made me realize that my definition of mindset and their definition of mindset were completely different. And so what I think of mindset, I put a lot of things in that bucket, and her definition of mindset was very narrow. So I thought that that might be the case for conflict. So in the chat function, go ahead and write 3 words that describe conflict to you and share it with everybody, because I want to see what everybody's thoughts about conflict are. So you should see the chat function at the bottom. So conflict with the kids, I might have voted significantly. So anger, disagreement, dissatisfaction, yelling. So a lot of emotion in those words, disagreement, judgment. So deciding on how to do things. So things are tense, argue, disconnection. So not being on the same page. A lot of disagreement. So we're all on the same page with that. Judgment is different. Difference in options. Yep. Stress and frustration, disagreement, argument, miscommunication. Yeah. So it seems like everybody agrees that disagreement is probably the main cause of conflict. And then there's a lot of words in here that are emotional words, and anxiety, no resolution, lack of communication. So some of these things could potentially point to resolutions in conflict, and we can talk about how we can use some of these things for conflict, but those are good. Let's take a look at some definitions that we can think about as we go through this. So I pulled 2 definitions. Any situation in which your concerns or desires differ from those people around you. So concerns or desires, and differ. So disagreement, things are different, or a mental struggle resulting from incompatible or opposing needs, drives, and wishes. So those are the five words I think that we can focus on: needs, drives, wishes, concerns or desires, and how they differ from other people. So when we think about conflict in this context, we're going to think about it between two different people, us and somebody else. I know that there's conflict between nations and states and political parties. We're not talking about those today, although this could probably relate to all of that. We're going to talk about it one-on-one so that we can have some actionable ways to deal with conflict. So I just wanted to get our heads around three different categories of conflict, of where conflict can come from. One big one is a conflict in a relationship, and I can do a whole webinar just on that alone. But when you think about relationship conflict, oftentimes the relationship conflict, that there is a break in trust. So it oftentimes goes back to maybe there's not enough trust, maybe the trust has been broken, or if it's somebody you don't know really well and they just give you a weird feeling, or you just rubbed you the wrong way, that could also be a trust issue, that you just don't trust them. A task conflict could be something as simple as we're all in a different situation. We have our families and our house all at the same time. So our worlds have changed. Everybody's at home, but sometimes the tasks are still there, but who's doing them might change, or who we're asking to do them. So let's take doing the laundry, for example. Maybe one person in your house always did the laundry, and now that's changed, or you want it to change because everybody's home and they can do the laundry too. So just the task itself can cause conflict. And then the process as well can cause conflict. So how you do the task may differ. So some people feel very strongly and like to have control over how things get done and want it done a specific way. If somebody else on your team or in your world doesn't do it that same way, it may cause conflict, and it may elevate depending on how big of a deal it is or what the task is that needs to get done. So those are just some examples of things that can trigger conflict. So we're going to talk about the conflict modes. So these conflict modes I'm talking about come from the Thomas Kilmann instrument, and this is an assessment that you can take. We're not taking it today because we're just going to talk about it and describe it and see it in ourselves. If you ever want to take it, you can let me know, but it's not necessary. Hopefully you'll be able to see yourself in this. But what this Thomas Kilmann instrument of conflict modes looks at, it's how you behave in a conflict situation. And it looks at it in two dimensions. So it looks at it first on the left, you'll see assertiveness. So how assertive are you? Meaning how much do you take care of your interests and sacrifice somebody else's interests? And on the cooperative line on the bottom, how cooperative are you, or how do you take care of somebody else's interests at the expense of your own interests? So that's what we're going to look at. So those two dimensions, and then all of the modes within those dimensions. So here are the 5 conflict handling modes that we're going to be talking about today: competing, collaborating, compromising, avoiding, and accommodating. And we're going to look at each one of these. So you can see where they are in the spectrum. None of them are good or bad. They all are just different modes, and they all have their purpose in dealing with some kind of conflict. But what happens is we tend to use one or more, maybe 2 of the modes as our dominant modes. So we may lean on one of those more than any of the others, and then we use them in all of our conflict situations. And then that's where problems arise, because they might not be the right mode to solve that particular conflict. So we'll look at, as we go through this, I want you to think about, where do I see myself in this mode? Is this something that I either do too much, too little? And when is the right time to use this mode? So that's what we're going to be looking at as we go through this. And we're going to start with the competing mode, because this one on the scale is high on assertiveness and low on cooperation, meaning these folks are in a power-oriented mode. They're thinking of themselves first and trying to get their needs met first. My way or the highway is a good way to describe them. They might be social activists where they're standing up for rights for people, defending a position, or just trying to win. Some people just like to win, and so they may lean on this mode too much. So here are some skills that somebody who is in a competing dominant mode might be showing. But they're good at arguing, they don't give up. But the times where this competing mode is good are in an emergency situation where a quick decision has to be made. This is when you want a competing mode dominant person to stand up and make a decision, because they're not going to be afraid. They're going to be confident in their decision, and they're going to get in there and make that decision. Also, when an important issue comes up, but the resolution is going to be unpopular. So somebody who is in a competing mode might not be afraid to go in and make a difficult decision and stand up for it. The other time this might be a good skill to use is when you're trying to protect yourself around somebody who is taking advantage of you. Leaning on the competing skills will help you protect yourself and stand up for yourself. So if you overuse competing skills, this might point to that this is your dominant mode. So some questions you can ask yourself if you're overusing the competing skills: are you surrounded by yes people? Does everybody always just say yes to you? Then you might be a competing mode person. Are people afraid to admit ignorance or uncertainty around you? They don't like to talk to you if they're not confident in their position. Then you might be showing up as a competing person, a competing mode person. So you can also underuse this skill. So there may be times when you should be using it and you're not using it. And you might recognize this in yourself if you're feeling powerless, if you feel uncomfortable when you're using it, or if you have trouble taking a firm stand, then you might recognize that you're not using this mode enough for you. The next mode is accommodating. So this is completely opposite from competing. So these are the people who are on the high cooperative scale, meaning they'll sacrifice their own needs for the needs of somebody else, and they're low on the assertive scale. So they're not fighting for themselves, they're just taking care of other people. So opposite of competing. And that you might describe them as self-sacrificing. They probably are generous and do a lot of charity, so they're constantly out helping other people. And they might be described as compliant or obedient. They do what they're told to do, and they don't really question it because it's important for them to make sure other people are getting their needs met versus their own needs. So here are some skills for the accommodating mode, but let's talk about when these might be important. So somebody might use the accommodating skill if the issue is more important to the other person than it is to them, and they're just willing to yield it. Sometimes they want to make sure that they give a goodwill gesture, especially if they're trying to maintain or increase a relationship with somebody. They might use the accommodating skill to give that goodwill and maintain the relationship. There might be times where that a disruption due to a conflict is not worth it, and it's important to keep the harmony. So if something's going on in your world, if you're studying for a test or you're really trying to focus on something, and a disruption because of a conflict is going to cause a problem in that flow, accommodating for a short term might be a good solution in order to keep the harmony going or keep the flow going. So if you're overusing it, this might be your dominant style. So you can ask yourself, do your ideas not get the attention they deserve sometimes? Or, this is a good one, is discipline lax on your team or in your house? So somebody who's high and accommodating might get taken advantage of because people know that they'll yield or that they can take advantage of them. And so sometimes discipline might get lax because the person that's in charge of discipline, if they're accommodating, might let that go a little bit. The underuse of accommodating, if you're not using this enough, you know, you might think about it as the opposite. You're back to competing. So if you're moved back into that competing mode, you might have trouble building goodwill, and you might need to pull on accommodating a little bit more. If people describe you as being unreasonable, then you might not be accommodating in certain situations enough when you could accommodate. Do you have trouble admitting when you're wrong? Or you can't recognize legitimate exceptions to the rule. So if there's an exception to the rule that is not that big of a deal, but you still won't relent on it, you might underuse accommodating. The next one is avoiding. So avoiding is on the bottom. So you're uncooperative and you're unassertive. So you're, this would be considered the, I'll think about it tomorrow people. They don't address conflict. They don't address it immediately anyway. They might be diplomatic, as some people might describe them. They sidestep to avoid the situation, and they might postpone for a better time. So sometimes when you might want to use avoiding skills is on an unimportant issue, or if there's more important issues you need to deal with and this is not an important issue, then you might just want to avoid the situation. If you know you're powerless in the situation and that status isn't going to change, then that might be a time where you might just avoid the conflict as well. If the cost outweighs the benefits of getting into this conflict, avoiding it for a short term may be the solution. And then oftentimes in conflict, the emotions will run high, right? So people get upset, and so sometimes at that moment, avoiding the conflict is the right thing to do to allow people to calm down, get in a better headspace so that the conversation can continue. So let's talk about if you're overusing avoiding, because this might be your dominant skill. So think about this and ask yourself these questions. Do people have a hard time getting your input? Do you, when people ask, do you not respond to their input? You just ignore it? Do people sometimes walk on eggshells around you because they're afraid that you're just going to ignore them? Or are decisions made on important issues by default? So you just decide not to make an issue, so it just gets made by default by not making the issue at all. So those might be some questions you can ask yourself to see if avoiding is your dominant mode. So if you're underusing avoiding, are you hurting people's feelings? So in certain situations, it may be okay to avoid so that you don't hurt people's feelings. So if you're stirring up hostilities and hurting people's feelings, you might not be using avoiding at the right times. And are you feeling overwhelmed by issues? So if you're trying to take on everything and trying to solve all conflicts and all issues, you're going to feel overwhelmed. You need to decide which are the ones that are important, which ones can I put off, which ones can I wait till later. And that's when you would use avoiding. All right, collaborating. So this one is high on assertive and high on cooperative. So you're trying to work together to get a win-win solution. And you're digging in, you're talking, you're listening, you're creating creative solutions on interpersonal issues. You're really trying to work together to get things done. The time when this is important is when the concerns of both people are too important to compromise. So they both, whatever's important to them, they both feel very strongly about it and they don't want to compromise. So collaborating is a good time to do that. When it's important to look at the other person's point of view, that's when collaborating is important, because you're talking and you're listening and you're trying to understand the other person's point of view so you can come to a solution. When you're bringing together ideas, and also when you're trying to gain commitment. So if you think about the tasks that are happening or the processes that are happening, it's important to gain people's commitment so that they'll actually do it. And one way to do that is to collaborate and listen to their ideas, incorporate their ideas, and make sure that everybody feels like they have a way to contribute to the solution. So if you are overusing collaborating, do you ask yourself, do you spend too much time discussing issues? Are you one of those people who every time something comes up, you say, we need to talk about this. We need to talk about the laundry. We need to talk about unloading the dishwasher. How do you feel about that? It doesn't have to be used on everything, and you don't have to talk about it for every complex situation. But if you do use this as your dominating mode, other people might feel it that way. If they stop wanting to collaborate with you, you might be doing it too much. If you underuse collaborating, then you're probably asking yourself, is it difficult to see the differences in other people's points of view? So you're not asking, you're not talking, you're not listening. So you're not really trying to see things from other people's point of view. So that's when collaborating might help you a little bit more if you need to do that. Are people not committing to the decisions that you're making? If you're making decisions and people aren't committing to them, then they may not feel like their point of view has been heard. So collaborating might not have been the solution you used to get there. Okay, the last one's the one right in the middle, and this is compromising, and this is the let's make a deal. And so some people would say this is the lose-lose, but it's really the I give a little, you give a little, and we come up with a solution together. Some sort of middle of the road, exchanging concessions kind of solution.
Well, get them running. Kick the ball around. Or
the times where you would use a compromising skills are when the goals are moderately important and it's not worth the effort to collaborate or to accommodate, meaning it's not worth the effort to go all the way to the far end of the accommodating or consideration side of the scale. Also, a time where you would use this is when two people have equal power in the situation, but they both have different goals. So they are equally powered, but they have different goals. So in order to reach those goals, they both might have to give up a little bit and concede a little bit. It could also be used for a temporary settlement for a very complex issue, or if you've already tried collaborating, or if you've already tried competing and those haven't worked, you could try compromising in that situation when it's complex and you have tried everything else. So if you're overusing compromising, you might notice that you're not looking at the big picture, that you're worried more about the negotiation and the getting the deal, and you're losing sight of the big picture. Also, you might notice that people become cynical on your team or your family because of the gamesmanship that's going on. Everybody's trying to, if I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. So people can become cynical in that situation. And then if you're underusing it, then sometimes you can feel uncomfortable with the negotiating. Not everybody likes the negotiating part. If you ever go to the car dealership and you go in and you have to negotiate a price for a new car, not everybody likes that. Some people love it. But if you're uncomfortable with that negotiation and trying to come up with a compromise, then you might be underusing it. Or if you don't want to give anything up, if you have a hard time giving any concessions, then you might be underusing compromise at the right times. All right, so these are the 5 conflict handling modes. So go ahead and click on where you think you saw yourself in these descriptions. So it looks like we're pretty evenly, there's no avoiding people, but everybody else is kind of, there's some competing people, accommodating, 31% more accommodating, collaborating, and compromising, but no avoiding. So it seems like people were able to see themselves in the poll. So what do you do when conflict occurs? So ask yourself these questions. When a conflict comes up, sometimes you have to step out of the situation and think about what is really happening. So ask yourself, is there a problem with trust? Are they dealing with stress in their lives? Likely a lot of people are dealing with stress in their lives right now, so that may be causing some extra conflict. So think about if that's where things are coming from. Do they know my expectations? Have I communicated it clearly, or do I know their expectations? Have they communicated it clearly? Is there a misunderstanding or a problem with communication that can be cleared up? So let's look at tips for resolving conflict. So first, listen more. So when you listen to other people, it shows that you care about their point of view, and it lets them get out what they're trying to say. And oftentimes when people have an opportunity to share what's on their mind and what they're thinking about, it reduces conflict just by listening. So talk less. So again, if you're listening and you're allowing somebody else to talk, as opposed to just jumping right in and sharing what you have to say first and telling them all your issues, let somebody else talk first. You listen, and they're going to feel like they're being heard as well. One way to do that is to ask questions. So oftentimes we assume we know what's going on. So when you saw those questions before, you might assume you know the answers, but until you ask them the questions, then you can't assume you really know what's going on inside of them. So asking open-ended questions like who, when, where, what, why, how, asking questions that way and being curious about what's really going on will help them feel again that their point of view is important and they're being heard, and that might reduce conflict. Trying to see things from another person's point of view. So really stepping outside yourself and empathetically looking at the situation for where they might be coming from. Their world has changed. Everything's different. They're working from home. They're studying from home. Their whole life is turned upside down. So how could that be causing conflict in their life? And how is that helping them or making them create conflict in everybody else's life? So think about what is their experience right now, and how could that be contributing to conflict? And then admit when you're wrong. This is a great way to stop a conflict, is being able to admit when you're wrong. So sometimes people can't do this. It's hard for especially the competing people because they just want to win, so they'll just keep going no matter what. But if you can stop and say, am I wrong, or is there part of what's happening about this that I can take responsibility for? Sometimes that will stop a conflict in its tracks, and it will get resolved immediately if you take responsibility for your part in it, or it will reduce emotions so that you can continue the conversation and deal with what's really going Don't forget that we're all in this together. We all should be rowing the same way, and we all have the same goals in mind. Nobody wakes up in the morning wanting to create conflict. And so when you're thinking about the people on your team, your family, whoever you're spending most of your time with, remember, assume good intentions. Assume that whatever decisions they're making, that they are making with good intentions, and that the problem or the conflict may be coming with for some other reason. So there may be a miscommunication or a misunderstanding of expectations, but really everybody has the same intentions and should have good intentions when we'll assume they have good intentions. All right, so everything that we've talked about today are tools that you can use to help you dealing with conflict. So likely you have one conflict mode that you lean on. It seemed like you all saw yourself in one or more of the conflict modes. So pay attention when you use it. So if you get into a conflict or a conversation, watch yourself and see what behaviors come up. And then if you think that there's a time where you can intentionally use a different mode to change the situation, then go ahead and switch it and try and do something different. Give yourself a break. This is like if you've never used a mode that you don't typically use, it's going to be like building a muscle. So my recommendation is just to pick one thing and start small. Just pick one behavior and try and change it and see what happens and step outside yourself. They say that the definition of maturity is being able to intervene on your own behaviors. So if you can recognize and have the self-awareness of when you are behaving a certain way, and if it's a way that you want to change, then intervening and behaving a different way is the sign of maturity. So, but you can't change everything. So just pick one thing and see if you can start changing things. So who has questions about anything that we talked about? Now that I can hear you.
Patrice, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay, this is Joni.
Hi.
You did a great job. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Yeah.
In your experience, is how we show up in conflict basically the same in any area of our lives? A two-part question. Or do you see more that we're able to compartmentalize, or we do compartmentalize business versus personal?
Yeah, so
and is there a better style for business versus personal? A two-part question.
Yeah. So I think as a general rule, you will show up in your most common response when you're most stressed. So the higher the stress level, the higher the emotions, the more likely you're going to show up in your most dominant mode. And that's going to be in either place that you can, whether it's work or at home. That's if the emotions are high, you're going to show up that way. Where you may have more control over yourself and intervening in your own behaviors and kind of recognizing in a work situation, you've maybe built some muscles to show up differently because you work differently at different places, and you know that being in a competing mode at work might not work with the people you work with. So I think that people can practice behaviors that way and might show up differently at different times, but I really think it depends on the level of emotion and stress involved at any time. Does that help?
It does. Great. Thank you. And thanks again for doing this.
Yeah, I'm glad you came.
Thank you.
Who else has a question?
Hi, Patrice, it's Avril.
Hey.
Thanks for putting this on today. It's all great information. My question is, for in today's times when we're all working from home and now we're doing things and we're on Microsoft Teams and Skype and all this kind of stuff, sometimes your tone is read a little bit differently, if you're not on video and it's just all via email or texting or what have you.
Yeah.
What do you do in that situation when it's a little bit more difficult to resolve a conflict, or you feel like you're not being heard correctly? Do you have any tips for that?
Well, I think you said part of it is that working virtually, anytime you can be on video, you're going to be able to build a relationship stronger than if you're just dealing with email and phone calls, because you don't feel as much of a connection with somebody. So if you can look somebody in the eye and see their body language, you'll be able to read them better. So conflict can definitely occur more if you're not on video. So the only other thing I would say about that is if you're using email exclusively, read through it and try and put yourself in their shoes to see how they might read it differently. If they're a sensitive person, go through it and look at it and say, is there anything in here? Did I write it in all caps? Am I, whatever it is. What is it that they could be reading in here, and trying to step outside yourself and see it from their point of view. All right. Any other questions?
I have one, Patrice. This is Heather. And I did put a comment in, by the way, to see if we might be able to get copies of those individual slides or to be able to see them again, because I noticed that I think I've used almost every style of conflict resolution, depending on, like you said, the situation, whether it's work or personal, and the stress levels and just different stages of life. But my specific question is, do you think that our tendency to use one style over another could also be affected by our comfortability or intimacy with an individual?
For sure. Yeah. So that's where I think it goes back to the trust. And so if you have a lot of trust and a lot of a strong relationship with somebody, you may be more willing to show your dominant mode, even if it's not your best side. So that's why,
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, that's why I think that people say, you treat the people you love the most the hardest, I guess, because you have a comfort level with them and you feel the trust with them that the relationship can withstand it. However, sometimes you need to, if that may chip away at the relationship, and so you need to be able to step outside yourself and say, is this doing more damage? Even though it's easy to do it with those folks. I agree with you, though. Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
And then can we take, I don't know if you said you're recording this, but would it be possible to just have a snapshot of?
Yeah, I'll post the slides on my website so you can download the PDF of them so you can have them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is really so wonderful. Thank you, Patrice.
Yeah.
It's great.
My pleasure. Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you got something out of it.
Hi, Patrice. I have a question, Tawny, if you guys don't know me.
Hey, Tawny.
Hi. Was anybody else surprised that their mode wasn't like almost everybody, because it seems like such a better word? I was so like, oh, everybody's going to be this because that's what I am, and obviously it's the best. And then I was surprised at the distribution. I was really surprised. Does that anybody else feel that?
Yeah.
No?
Well,
I did. Yeah. I was surprised.
I think that's
really
a symptom that often, because we tend to be just human beings, are self-centered people, so we assume that if we think a certain way, everybody must think that way. And that's why these kind of things are so good, because you can kind of step outside yourself and say, wait a second, not everybody thinks this way. I don't get that, So I think that it's not an uncommon experience to think, well, shoot, why isn't everybody competing, or why isn't everybody accommodating? But in reality, it was like almost a clear distribution, except for avoiding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I'm super self-centered.
Well, we all are.
That's what I'm learning.
No, yeah. I mean, that's just the human nature. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just how we are. But as we become more self-aware, you start to realize, and that's what helps with conflict, is you realize that, well, wait, not everybody deals this way. And then you can start to see them dealing with conflict in a different way. And as you go throughout your day, you'll be recognizing people's behaviors and going, oh, they might be, avoiding, or they might be competing, and you'll start to see it in other people. Wow. All right. What else? Anything?
I have another question.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know what other people are adding into their repertoire that they think that they don't use often enough. Mine is avoiding. I think I attack every little detail too much. And so that's the thing that I am going to try to, what did you say? Establish my maturity by intervening.
Yeah, intervening in your behavior by.
Yes. I'm curious to know what other people, or if they're willing to say what they're changing or
So I'll tell you what I
integrating into
am. So when I actually took the assessment, so I am super accommodating. Like when that phrase at the top of the one slide that said, I'm happy to help, or whatever it is, how can I help? Or I say that like that's a common thing that comes out of my mouth. I'm very accommodating. So I think competing is probably something that I have to practice more and build that skill, just so that I don't get taken advantage of, because I am willing to help, and I actually get something out of helping people. So but sometimes it doesn't serve me. So I would say competing is probably something I can get better at. Anybody else?
I think that this is Heather. I'm like you, Tawny, sometimes will avoid because I have more of a dominant style, or I did, as a younger kid, being the oldest of 4. And then with work, I had to do that, being, in leadership. But in between, I'm also very accommodating. So then I start to get confused and then I'll just avoid. So I'm cognizant that I'm doing it, but I think practicing and being aware is the key.
Yep, I agree. It's starting to watch and be aware.
Hey, Patrice, this is Holly. I just want to add that recently I started avoiding more in my career, which sounds negative, but in actuality it's not, because as was just pointed out, there are certain situations that deserve a pause or avoidance for a day or two to see if things kind of work themselves out or kinks kind of unwind. And it's been very effective, and trying to balance that with the competing and the collaborating has been really helpful for me. And I love that that was called out in this presentation, because I wasn't really conscious of why I was doing it or what I was doing. And seeing this matrix and how it was presented was really helpful from a behavioral standpoint when it comes to conflict situations. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's interesting when you can look back and see like, oh, I've actually been trying to do this already. I just didn't have a framework to see it, or I didn't recognize that I was actually doing it. But yeah, as we get more experience, you can try different things. And I'm happy to hear that you were able to incorporate that for yourself.
Now I have a name for it.
Exactly. Funny. All right. Anybody else have any questions or comments about their experience? All right. Well, we're almost at the top of the hour, so the timing was perfect on this, and I apologize for the slight audio problems. But thank you so much for taking the time to do this with me. This was really fun for me to do, and I've always wanted to do something, and this was just a good time to do it with everybody being in a different situation, and I thought that I could use my skills to help. So thank you for indulging me. And again, if you have any questions or want to reach out to me, if you want to take the assessment, I can help you with that. But again, not necessary if you feel like you got all this out of that. And I will post the slides like I told Heather. And yeah, just let me know. And I appreciate it.